Well, I should say probably it's actually noon, so it is actually not good morning. It is good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Caroline Ruckert, and I have the privilege of being the Dean of Student Experience and Employability at Griffith University. And I also have the distinct pleasure of being today's moderator. I also am proudly the co-chair of the WIL Australia Advocacy and Engagement Committee. And on behalf of my co-chairs, Nicola Fish, Faith Valencia Forrester, I am absolutely delighted to welcome you to this first webinar, Understanding the National Code and Implications for WIL. This is the first webinar in a two-part series focused on supporting the WIL sector to understand and respond to the new National Higher Education Code to prevent and respond to gender-based violence. Before I provide an overview of today's session, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge country and would invite you to do so as well in the chat. WIL Australia acknowledges the traditional custodians of the lands on which we all meet and gather today and pays respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And we extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us today. As we come together to discuss work-integrated learning, we recognize the importance of place, community, and lived experience in shaping knowledge and learning. We also acknowledge the ongoing contributions of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to education, practice, and community leadership. So now that we have appropriately situated ourselves in acknowledged place, I am delighted to talk a little bit about today's session. So the goal of today's webinar is really to support WIL practitioners and institutional leaders to better understand the new policy landscape and specifically to understand the new policy in the context of its implications for WIL policy, practice, and our quality assurance processes. So with that in mind, today's session has four key objectives. First, we want to work with you to build an understanding of gender-based violence within higher education and WIL contexts. And in that first part of the webinar, we're going to introduce you to the key concepts and definitions of the code. The second part of today is understanding the code itself, including what has changed and what institutions will now be required to demonstrate. The third objective for today is to explore implementation considerations across the WIL lifecycle through a quality assurance and student safety lens. And then that will also provide a space for discussion, reflection, and we're also keen to respond to your questions as well. Today's webinar will run for approximately 1 hour, and it brings together a unique set of experts spanning across the gender-based violence prevention space and the WIL sector. And so joining us today are our panelists. I'm delighted to introduce Megan Sharp, Gender-Based Violence Specialist at Griffith University, Rhiannon Tanner, Senior Coordinator, Primary Prevention at Deakin University, and Nicola Fish, WIL Manager, Academic Programs at Swinburne University. So the session will be structured in three parts today. The first part of the webinar will set the context, including key definitions, the broader policy environment, and how we arrived at this point as a sector. That will then lead into the second part, which will provide a deeper dive into the national code itself, including key expectations and implications for institutions. And then the third part of today's webinar will focus specifically on the implications for WIL, including considerations relating to student safety, risk, partnership, and quality assurance across the WIL cycle. We've also allowed at the end plenty of time for your questions and discussions. So with that, I am absolutely delighted to hand the baton over to Megan and Rhiannon, who will get us started. So over to you, Megan and Rhiannon.
Thank you very much, Caroline. And before we go any further, I'd also like to just take a moment to acknowledge any trauma that might be in the room today. Unfortunately, statistics do tell us that gender-based violence does impact far too many people in our community. So I just wanted to give everybody a heads up. We are talking about gender-based violence today, obviously. We'll be speaking about it quite broadly. We will be addressing some prevalence data. We will talk about some examples and some types of gender-based violence, but we won't dig too deeply into any details around the more serious end of gender-based violence in today's webinar. So I would just remind you all to look after yourselves, be aware of yourselves, be aware of what you're feeling, if you've got any reactions that are happening in your body, and really lean into that and make sure that you do take a moment. If you need to step away, that is entirely fine. Please just make sure that you look after yourselves. Faith has put some external support services in the chat for people to reach out to if required. And also just a reminder that you can also get in contact with your EAP at your own university as well. That done, we'll now move into why gender-based violence matters in work integrated learning. So gender-based violence is a significant and ongoing national issue. I'm sure you're all aware to some degree. The work that we're doing under the code is underpinned by actually the National Plan to Prevent Violence Against Women and Children, and then also sits within the framework of the Universities Accord. So the National Higher Education Code to prevent and respond to gender-based violence. And that is why I always just call it the code, because it is quite a mouthful. That is, I suppose, the new driving force across the sector to uplift the work that we have focused on in this space and to take us, I guess, into creating more respectful and safer communities in future. So some key things to think about today. Risk in work integrated learning is often quite subtle. It won't always be a significant incident or a significant behaviour that might present to you as a WIL practitioner. But gender-based violence really looks more broadly at patterns of behaviour, at the drivers behind behaviour, and really stops to acknowledge that this can be quite subtle, it can be quite cumulative, and often the behaviours within gender-based violence are quite normalised. Things like sexual harassment and behaviours under that, they're things that we have just been conditioned to put up with, to turn a blind eye to, but they do still have impact. So it's also important to acknowledge that students going out into work integrated learning placements are operating in very low power and high dependence environments. So this is something that they rely on often in order to meet course requirements or perhaps even as part of graduation requirements. And they are relying on this workplace to provide them with this opportunity, likewise relying on the university to assist them with managing these placements as well. So that puts students in quite a vulnerable position and may impact, therefore, the way that they respond or the way that they react when they see a response either within that workplace or within the university as well. Boundaries can be blurred. Students are operating both as a university student, they are operating as a member of the workplace when they're on placement. And there are just, by virtue of the arrangements of work integrated learning partnerships, blurred boundaries between what is the university's remit, what is the placement provider's remit. Not to say that we can't all work together to find ways to, I guess, clarify some of that blurring, but it is just a reality of work integrated learning. The universities care, and particularly under the National Code actually stipulates that universities have a requirement to respond to disclosures of gender-based violence regardless of where they have occurred. Obviously, the particulars around incidents of gender-based violence will impact how much a university can respond. Absolutely, at the very minimum, we should always be providing support and care to students that are impacted by gender-based violence, and colleagues for that matter. But in terms of any further investigation or things like that, that will depend on particulars of circumstances. Having said that, it is, I guess, really important to understand in the WIL context that absolutely now this is a space that is within our remit to have some responsibility over. Certainly we have a duty of care to respond to students that might experience behaviours while they're on placement, and then to support them to regain their sense of self and their sense of safety and their ability to continue on with that placement arrangement and also with their studies moving forward. It's important to note that harm impacts a range of I guess, factors within a student's life. It may impact their learning. It may impact very immediately their ability to continue on in that work integrated learning placement. It might impact their ability to engage in future work integrated learning placements. And then when they come back to university, both the harm itself and also the way that the harm or the disclosure of harm is managed will have a major impact on that person's their learning, their person themselves, their well-being, their health. It's not just something happened on placement, we had to talk about it, and then we move on. This can be really ongoing harmful impacts for individuals. So effective work integrated learning requires clear reporting pathways. It requires risk management, both, I guess across all spectrums of the WIL life cycle, and Nicola will take you through a lot of that later on. And it requires really clear and effective support systems as well. And as practitioners in the WIL space, you absolutely form a really integral part of that support ecosystem that we'll be providing. Well, we already do provide to students, but certainly that we'll be continuing to provide to students into the future. I guess the last main point is that trauma-informed practice is essential. Trauma-informed practice is a buzzword. Some of you may be more familiar with it than others. It is certainly under the code absolutely going to be prioritised in all of the work that is done across the sector, and will actually, as the code is rolled out and institutions mature in compliance in the next few years, it certainly will be a practice that underpins everything that we do. So not just the responses that we provide to students where they've been impacted by harm, but it will also start to really be evident in our planning, in our governance, in our decision making, everything that we do. Next slide, Faith. So what does the data tell us? And I won't, I guess, stick on the data for too long, but it is important, and it does start to paint a bit of a picture to understand why we need to talk about this, why work integrated learning is now incorporated under the work that we're doing under the National Code. So our reality is that the National Student Safety Survey told us that 1 in 6 students had experienced sexual harassment, and 1 in 20 had experienced sexual assault since starting at university. There will be another National Student Safety Survey conducted this year, so it will be interesting to see if we have had any hopefully positive shift in those statistics. However, the fact that we are creating safer, more trustworthy spaces for our students to come and tell us about things might actually bump those statistics up. So it might look a little bit worse, but that could be a good sign that actually students trust us to come and get support from us. So looking specifically at sexual harassment during work experience or professional placement, there's a few demographics there that we pulled from the National Student Safety Survey data to show how different cohorts of students might be impacted. So 1 in 15 students aged 25 to 34 have experienced sexual harassment during placement. 1 in 17 have experienced sexual harassment during work experience in total or professional placement. 1 in 14 postgrad coursework students have experienced sexual harassment during placement, and 1 in 13 international students have experienced sexual harassment during placement. We've also looked into some workplace data, obviously through the Respect at Work survey and resulting regulations that have come out from that with positive duty. There has been I guess, a more focused look at the prevalence of sexual harassment, particularly in a workplace context. And certainly under the National Code is a whole of institution thing, so it will start to look in more detail at what is happening across both our student bodies as well as our staff or workforce bodies. And we will start to be able to form some better data on what that looks like in higher ed for staff as well as for students in the years to come, as all of that data becomes a bit more mature. But I guess from a workplace perspective, it's important to note that Some industries, some disciplines might have higher risk factors. There are some industries or even environmental factors, for example, more regional or remote placements as compared to CBD type placements. Each placement situation will have its own risk factors. Some of that might be industry or discipline driven. Some of that might be environmentally driven. So just some important things to think about when you're working through those arrangements with students. Next slide, please. Thank you. So what does gender-based violence look like in work-integrated learning? What does it look like overall? Here are some examples, but also let's specifically think about what you might see or what students might be coming to tell you about their work-integrated learning experience. So sexual harassment. Sexual harassment, as I mentioned before, is often something that is it's not recognised, it's quite normalised, we're all conditioned to it. So it is something that you probably might need to listen a little bit harder if a student is explaining some different behaviours to you, and really acknowledge that these are serious and they have had an impact and they have been harmful. So that can be things like comments and jokes. It can be inappropriate touching. Maybe they've been added on to a workplace message chat function, or maybe it's something that they're doing with other students at the university. You know, different like comments and remarks, intrusive questions, comments that they feel have been targeted at them because of their gender or their sexuality, or may have even been directed at somebody else that in their sphere because of their gender or their sexuality. Abuse of power, this is a key one for students on work integrated learning placement. As I outlined before, they are there because they need something from the placement provider that is really vital to their studies. So that it inherently puts them at a really, really low threshold in terms of the power that they have in the relationship. There might be different things like threats to their grades, threats to being able to go on placement ever again, threats to providing references if they speak up about things. So if students are mentioning things like that, it's important to acknowledge that that is harm and that is coercion and control, and that it is absolutely something that the university can support them through. Online abuse, quite similar, I suppose, to some of the sexual harassment things, but obviously in a more digital environment. Online abuse can also extend into things like, image-based abuse with AI now in the world and deep fakes and things like that. The instances and the likelihood and the ease of being able to perpetrate those kinds of things is only getting easier, unfortunately. So these are things that our students will continue to be dealing with in more frequency, I suppose. So targeting of gender diverse students, that is really where a student feels that maybe they have been excluded because of their gender identity or their sexuality. Probably we could have put in that dot too. It's also things like intentional misgendering of a student, where maybe a colleague or a manager at their placement place understands that they have certain pronouns that they would like to be addressed by, and they would like to be introduced by certain pronouns and with a certain identity, and just blatant disregard of that. It can also include things like intentional outing of a person, and comments around masculinity and femininity and task appropriateness, and using that against the individual as well. So in terms of gender-based bullying, so that can be stereotyping, exclusion, task-related things, as I just mentioned, the masculine and feminine tasks, and a person feeling targeted, that they are being told that they have to do these tasks because of their gender, or they're being excluded from certain tasks because of their gender. Sexual violence, and this is probably something that would be more prominent where our students are going into placement scenarios where they're interacting with members of the public as well and other third parties. You think of hospital settings and education settings, where our students might be at higher risk of things like assault or coercion from other members of the public as well. And then we have, I've just blurred two dots into one, client and public behaviour. So oftentimes these can be dismissed as just part of the job. Oh yeah, that's just what it's like here. These kinds of things happen. You'll be right. It happens to all of us. It doesn't mean that whatever incident has occurred with that student hasn't left them with some harm and some trauma. So it's really important that we take all of these things seriously. And I've just realised that I've done Rhiannon's whole slide. So now I'm going to hand over to Rhiannon. I'm really sorry.
That's okay. So I just wanted to go into a little bit of detail around how gender-based violence is being defined under the National Code. And so it is looking at any form of physical or non-physical violence, harassment, abuse, or threats based on gender that results in harm, coercion, control, fear, or loss of autonomy. And I guess this definition is designed to capture the work that universities have done previously around sexual harm, sexual harassment, as well as things like family violence supports, but also to capture a wide range of behaviours that aren't always acknowledged as gendered. So things like stalking and tech-facilitated forms of abuse. And also really that acknowledgement of economic and financial and psychological forms of abuse that can have gendered patterns as well. So we know that not all interactions between different people of different genders are going to be classified as gender-based violence, and some interactions between people of the same gender can also be gender-based violence. And so Griffiths, for instance, are looking at developing guidance on what is and isn't gendered so that people can develop a bit more of that understanding. And Deacon's also working on resources around helping people to understand what gender-based violence can look like in different scenarios between different people of different identities, and looking at some of those intersections between things like disability, racial marginalisation, and some of the unique experiences of the LGBTIQA+ communities as well. In terms of the way the definition plays out in practice, though, most universities will generally respond on the way that a behaviour is experienced, rather than the gender of the people involved. And this is because although there are those gendered patterns of perpetration where the majority of perpetrators are men, and the experiences are gendered, so women and non-binary and trans people are more likely to experience gender-based violence, we'll respond on the basis that anyone can experience gender-based violence and people of all genders do. And it's just looking at how we put that into practice. So if someone experiences sexual harassment, that's going to be the focus of our approach, regardless of who that individual who experiences sexual harassment is. And I guess that we need to be thinking about the way that we apply that, given in WIL settings in particular, we're not likely to see the university support services be the first port of call. Is likely to be WIL coordinators or people in the actual placements themselves that are that first port of call. So I'll pop back to you, Megan, for the next bit.
So I guess just quickly, gender-based violence is a space that has matured probably quite quickly over the last 7 or 8 years across the sector. Acknowledging that it's also something that you have been dealing with as WIL practitioners since the beginning of time of work integrated learning placements. So I guess we just wanted to acknowledge that this is not new, but certainly the way that it is regulated has certainly been on a pretty sharp trajectory over the years. So if we look at 2017, that's when the Change the Course report came out, which was the first whole of sector survey of students to understand what their experiences were around sexual assault and sexual harassment in a university context. We've then had a series of other, I guess, national level papers, including the university's accord, including things like respect at work in a workplace perspective, and also, as I mentioned earlier, that overarching national plan to eliminate violence against women and children. So in our sector, if we've looked across from 2017, we had Change the Course, then we had Respect Now Always, which was established as a sector-wide initiative by Universities Australia, and that was trying to commence efforts, I suppose, to bring together the efforts across the sector. We had another National Student Safety Survey in 21 with the results released the following year. And then across 24, 25 and now into 26, there's been the Universities Accord, a National Higher Education Action Plan, and now the National Code. So now we've moved, I suppose, from almost a voluntary best practice, a good practice, acknowledging that wellbeing and safety are really key elements in our space and that we needed to put more focus into them, to now actually being regulated around what efforts we're putting into this. So what does the National Code require? It requires proactive and preventative approaches. So a lot of effort up until this point has gone into responses and making sure that we were responding to students who had been harmed the best way that we could. Now we're looking at that from a whole of organisation perspective. It's looking at students and staff and looking at what can we do, tapping into positive duty as well. What can we do to actually mitigate risk before it occurs? How can we identify the risky areas within our institutions, of which work integrated learning is one? And what can we do as, I guess, to preempt where we can add in some additional factors around student safety and wellbeing, and also around the governance that sits around that. It requires a coordinated approach and it requires accountability across the organisation, as well as now, I guess, reaching out into some accountability of our WIL providers as well. But that is on us to manage, and that sits with us as a sector to be responsible for making sure that we are, I guess, ensuring accountability from our partner providers as well. There's shared responsibility across students, across staff, across all facets of the organisation, from governance and university councils right down to staff operating on the ground. It's seeking consistent and embedded practice. It's actually really seeking consistent practice across the whole sector. So if a student went from one university to another, and something awful was to occur, or they were looking for prevention initiatives to be involved in, they should be able to find something really, really similar, and they should have a similar experience wherever they go. It's a lot about ensuring that staff know their roles, their boundaries, and the pathways that are available to provide support and the most effective support when harm occurs. It's also about being trauma-informed and evidence-driven. There is a huge amount of data collection and reporting that is now required by the GBV regulator in the Department of Education. The intent of that is to, I guess, almost force the sector to look at what is occurring, where is it occurring, who are our most vulnerable students and staff, or what are our most vulnerable areas of the university, or what are our most vulnerable activities, and to take some preventative action and risk mitigation action in those areas as well. Now we'll look through the 7 standards of the code, Rhiannon.
Yep, so you can pop to the next slide again. Thank you. So the code does cover 7 standards. The leadership and governance one is about the whole of organisation approach, ensuring that there are risk assessments of the whole organisation, and a lot of people who've commenced or completed their risk assessments will be picking up that things like WIL, field trips, any remote study related travel is coming up in a bit of a risk area. So those are things to be aware of. And it's making sure that the organisation as a whole is accountable for the experiences of their students, not just when they're on campus. So that's where it connects in with that WIL area. The safe environments and systems looks at all our policies. It looks at onboarding new staff, making sure appropriate checks are completed. So working with children checks and additional detail around, I'll go into a little bit more of this later, but how we create and establish a system and an environment that is safe for students and staff in the first instance. Knowledge and capability looks at those aspects around training, specialist training in some instances, and also awareness raising activities to make sure people know where they can get support when they need it. Safety and support is looking at those support services. So someone who has an experience and wants to seek support and information about what their options are. For a lot of universities, that will be a safer community service or something similarly named. And then we have safe processes, which looks at that stage once someone makes a formal report and making sure those processes are trauma informed, that they're fair, and that people understand what they're embarking on before they engage in that process. The data and evidence Megan's mentioned, there's a lot around collecting data on incidents, on reports, on disclosures, around the details of the people who make those disclosures and who are involved, the locations of incidents, and really to get a really solid understanding both within our individual universities and across the whole sector in terms of where things are happening and what the real risk areas are and how responses look in those areas. And then the student safe accommodation. Now, this predominantly applies to specific student accommodation that's provided for more long-term student accommodation, but it is worth thinking in the context of WIL placements about where students are staying when they are on placements. Are there conflicts of interest around that? If their supervisor for a placement is also going to be their landlord for a period of time, what does that mean for people? Next slide, please. So in terms of the safe environments and systems, this is really about setting up the organisations and the policy environment to make sure we're doing the best things we can to begin with. So it's around clear gender-based violence policies and procedures that apply regardless of where the gender-based violence occurs. And I know Megan mentioned this just before, but it's been a real point for the university, from the Department of Education, that universities are responding to all cases and supporting students regardless of where that happens, and in some cases supporting investigations that are beyond the traditional exploration of the nexus of the university. Pre-employment screening. So it is now a requirement that any new staff member coming into a university be asked if they've engaged in gender-based violence or had an investigation or finding against them. And then there's risk management around making sure that's being assessed appropriately. It also talks about when students go through a process of where there may be a disciplinary action, that non-disclosure agreements are not being used, and articulates very clear details around the policies and procedures and what they need to look like. Next slide, please. So in terms of knowledge and capability, obviously training is a really big part of this. This is about making sure students and staff all receive some level of training around what gender-based violence is, how they can be engaged in preventing it, where they can get support, and also how they can support others who may have these experiences. For specialist staff, so those who have particular roles in responding to students, this may mean that they need an extra level of training. So anyone involved in receiving disclosures or undertaking investigations needs to have training on trauma-informed practices and how they apply that in those situations. And also for support services, they need to conduct risk assessments as part of that process, so making sure they've got the appropriate training for that. But it stretches beyond that to making sure that students and staff are aware of where all the support options are, and broader work to engage in creating that safe and respectful environment and culture change. And that can be through awareness campaigns, the communications, and other activities that we undertake in that traditional prevention space. Next one, please. In terms of safety and support, so this is really talking about those safer community type services or employee wellbeing programs, anywhere that people will go in that initial instance to seek support for experiences of gender-based violence. It is around making sure there's not just one way to access those services, and also making sure there's anonymous options available for people to test the waters before they might want to proceed to a more formal support arrangement or move into that formal report. It is really important that that support is given regardless of the intention of the person involved to make a formal report, and that can't be a requirement of them for getting support. And it also talks to the protection of privacy, dignity and autonomy, and that trauma-informed practice that Megan is going to go into a bit more detail about in a minute. Safe processes, big part of this is around timeliness. There's really clear articulation of the timelines for conduct, proceedings and outcomes. There's really explicit advice and information around when a discloser and a respondent need to be informed about different stages in a process. There's clear timelines around the appeals processes and how quickly they need to be resolved. And also, as I mentioned, bans on non-disclosure agreements once a final outcome is reached. Next one, please. And then the data and evidence. So as I've mentioned, there's a huge amount of data required to be collected, but it's not just that we collect it, it's also that we learn from that data and that feeds back into our policies, our processes, our awareness raising, and the way that we deliver services at our universities. And I guess, there are questions in that around where did this gender-based violence occur, and it may be that this highlights aspects of work integrated learning or other activities that are part of learning or the university work that sits outside of the traditional on-campus or online environments. Back to Megan.
So, as I mentioned before, trauma-informed practice will become something that is much more embedded across all the things that we do at universities. And so it will be something that I think you will naturally become more aware of, more informed of, and start to probably understand really that you're using more than you may have really understood and recognised in the past. So there are some key principles around trauma-informed practice that I'll just run through quickly with you today. Sorry, Faith, you've jumped the gun on me. Can we just go back? Thank you. So they are safety. So prioritising safety. So safety always comes first, no matter what's going on when you're responding to someone, safety comes first. Their immediate safety, as well as then starting to think about what their ongoing safety might be. Choice. So you as practitioners understanding what the choices are. So what's available at your university, what other services are there, where are the specialists, who are the best people for students to speak to if they're experiencing issues, and you being able to give an overview of what those choices are. They might be support, they might be reporting. It will be guided by the student at the time. Empowerment. So that is really enabling the student to choose which choice they want to embark on. Different students will choose different things for different reasons. And some students might actually say, actually, I don't want to do anything about this right now. And that is a perfectly fine and okay choice that can be supported too. Trust, that's about being really clear about what your role is in supporting a student and where actually things might start to creep outside your scope and where they would be best to go and engage with someone in a more specialist role. So that could be things like in terms of investigating an incident or providing some counselling, but it might also be things like them asking, well, I want this contract torn up. I don't think you should ever send students to that provider ever again. So it's just about acknowledging what your limitations are, what your role is, being really clear about that so that you're not setting any unreasonable expectations for that student in terms of you'll be able to fix all of the problems. Collaboration, that's about working with them. So it's not about doing things to them or for them. It is about working with them. So it might still be that you make a referral, but you do that following a discussion. You let them know, okay, we've got this team over here in our student safety and wellbeing area. They can help you with X, Y, and Z. Would you like if I make a warm referral for you, or would you like the details and you can go and do that yourself? So I guess it's really just remembering it's with the person, not for the person, and there are some caveats around that in terms of immediate safety and wellbeing. If you are concerned that there is immediate risk of harm to that person or to others around them, then sometimes we have to jump outside that collaboration piece. But otherwise, always be guided and always do this with the person involved. Next slide, Faith. So we'll run through quickly what that looks like in practice. So that is about recognising when a student comes and makes the disclosure, recognising what are they describing to you. Does this sound like it's something that might be related to gender-based violence? Acknowledging, though, that we're only making that determination at this point just to guide what the next steps are. There are some really specific steps that we now have to take under the National Code that might not be applicable to all scenarios that students might raise with you. So just getting an understanding, does it sound like it could be something gendered? Are they telling you that this is a gendered thing? In which case, you know which options to provide and what the next steps might look like. Responding, be really careful about the words that you're using. You need to be empathetic, you need to be compassionate. As I said before, staying within your boundaries, explaining the options, explaining your limitations, but also making sure that you're avoiding anything that might make the student feel like they are to blame for what's occurred. We are empowering them, we are supporting them, and we are making sure that we can help them get to the next stage of healing. Referral, so that is building from explaining what the support services are. Maybe that's making a warm referral, as in sending an email or making a phone call on behalf of the student to connect them with the support service, or maybe that's providing them the information and leaving it to them to embark on that journey on their own. It's about understanding the formal reporting processes, the support processes, and assisting the student within your scope to do that. And then there will be a review part in terms of this individual scenario, but then also what does the bigger picture look like in terms of WIL placements and maybe the relationship with that provider as well. But I will hand over now to Caroline and to Nicola to take us through the next phase.
Thank you so much, Megan and Rhiannon. That's super interesting, and it sets a really lovely context for the next section. So we're looking at the stages of the WIL life cycle and what that means in respect to WIL quality assurance and our response to the gender-based violence code. So you've already done it, Faith. Lovely, thank you. So I'm just going to give a brief summary. So these are some of the questions that we might help guide us to understand what we're doing already really well, where the gaps might be, and what we might need to do to improve our processes. And I think I just want to start by saying that there's so much good work already being done in the WIL space. So this isn't an exhaustive set of questions. It is really just this idea of asking ourselves, how does it look? What are our responsibilities across those various stakeholders and across the WIL life cycle? So, for example, when we look at pre-placement, it really is about this idea of preparation and prevention, and again, across all those stakeholders. So in respect to students, it sort of comes back to some of what Megan and Rhiannon were saying around how do we prepare students to be empowered and have agency in understanding what their rights and responsibilities are, how GBV might present itself in the workplace, and our response to preparing students to understand and feel safe. Again, that word safe comes across a lot in these next few slides. So that's that pre-placement that might be undertaken through workshops, curriculum, and other support factors that we'd support students with. In respect to universities, I think one of the clear things that we're learning through this is that it has to be an institutional-wide response. We can't be working in isolation, irrespective of what our models are like at our institutions, and they can vary. We do need an institution-wide response. That is a critical part of the quality assurance. Gets us all on the same page. We have shared understandings and expectations, and that permeates through to our other stakeholders, which is our students and our industry and community hosts. So how are we responding to it across an institution? What is our approach to ensure that we've got this collective institution-wide response? How are we preparing students and our partners, industry and community, to respond, to prevent, and to report gender-based violent incidents? And like I said, that institutional-wide approach, and we're doing a lot of work already across the sector. For our partners, it's quite an interesting concept around helping industry and community who are experts in a number of areas. How do we quality assure our partnerships in preventing and responding to GBV? And in particular, this WIL context, I think it was Megan who was talking about the fact that students wear many hats. They're learners, they're students, they're employees, and how we ensure our industry and community partners understand the context of WIL. How do we quality assure that they're able to review workplace culture, respond to GBV complaints, and support an institutional-wide response to this national code. So that pre-placement preparations part is really critical. It's what I'd call that foundation for success, shared understandings and expectations. Then we have our during placement. Here we might look at things like response, support and monitoring. When we think about quality assurance, we might say during the placement is where we can really build these reciprocal relationships, embed shared understandings and response measures, and also set ourselves up for success, and that tripartite relationship success where we're all winners, so to speak. So do students know where to get support? Are we providing them with a safe space in which to report, discuss, disclose? And I found Megan's comment around, I think it was around this idea of safety. It sort of permeates through this during phase of the WIL life cycle for all stakeholders. Do they have agency and control? Are we embedding and integrating signposts, reminders, quality supervision practices, connections to peers and universities that helps reduce the somewhat isolated nature of placement learning experiences? There needs to be a consistency around this as well. Just because we've done something in the placement stage, how are we continuing our support and signposting for students during placement so that they're reminded you have a safe space. With the university is your learning institution, and we're here to support you and provide you with that sort of confidence. As universities, I think it's really important, again, that we have embedded and implemented processes and procedures that support academics or any educators and staff involved in WIL to be able to respond, identify, and process. So what are we doing? How are we quality assuring our industry and community partners to recognise and understand GBV and WIL? Where are our check-ins? How are we quality assuring our relationships with industry and community hosts to prevent and respond quickly and safely to GBV incidences? And I think also one of the other things that were mentioned earlier on is, where do we situate industry and community and students to feel safe, in particular students, to disclose and report GBV without consequences that to them are a barrier? So you lose your placement, you don't get your grade, you extend your degree, all these types of kind of consequences that they might perceive as a barrier to advocating for their safety and well-being. And for our industry and community hosts, for me, there's a lot of things around quality assuring the supervision of WIL, assuring safe and inclusive environments and workplaces for our students. How do we support our partners to escalate, know who to escalate to, and support them in responding to any incidents that might arise? And last but never least is the post-WIL evaluation around accountability and improvement. That's kind of piece around evidence-informed data to understand what's happened, why it happened, and what we can learn from that and how we implement that moving forward. So post-placement is an interesting space for students. So how do we get students to reflect on what they learnt, but importantly, identify and support them to recognise that their experience they might want to disclose later. So how do they know that they've always got access to post-placement support if they haven't disclosed whilst on placement for whatever reason? And this is those reflect, evaluation and feedback loops that need to be embedded in the student learning experience. I think for universities, it's also about evidence-informed. And again, Megan and Rhiannon referenced this. We collect a lot of data. And we need to ensure that we're recording this, that we're reflecting on it, we're evaluating it, we're measuring it, and then we're thinking, well, how is that going to improve our processes and procedures and our quality assurance measures? And we might also find that alongside the work that we're doing here, we would also be referencing the WIL quality framework that's just recently been revised to support our understanding and our prevention and response. So two ways of evaluating and reporting, both students and universities, but also our industry and community partners. Are we collecting data from them? Are we evaluating? Are we allowing an opportunity for students to share evaluation on supervision and the WIL experience? Also, what I feel is super important is when we're starting to respond to this in a more collective sort of sector-wide approach, how do we come together to share our learnings, support best practice, and importantly, co-create, collaborate and design in purposefully and meaningful ways across all stakeholders? And I think, that sort of permeated through a lot of what was mentioned earlier with Megan and Rhiannon. But those are the kind of synergies across those during and post-WIL lifecycle stages and those three stakeholders that are a critical part of WIL. So I think that's it for me, Caroline. Happy to take some questions.
Excellent. So we've so the goal of this webinar was to provide you with a critical reading of the of the code and just what it might mean for will practice. What we want to do now is we want to open the floor up, and we've got about 10 minutes around questions. If you pop your questions in the chat, and if we don't get to all of them, we will also have an opportunity to follow up with you. So just while folks are putting their questions in the chat, I just might invite the panelists just to reflect and just to ask you each, Megan and Rhiannon and Nicola, if there was one final reflection that you had, what's one thing that you would hope the will sector takes away from today's conversation around the new code?
For me, I think it's a greater awareness around what this actually means, but hopefully the importance of a collective response across the sector, that if we can learn with and from each other, we're going to have a greater impact, and the importance of an institutional-wide approach.
Excellent. Thank you. Anything that you'd add to that, Megan and Rhiannon? And we've got a couple of questions coming through, so.
I think just picking up on that institutional-wide approach, it feels like a lot of work individually when I'm particularly working with different areas across Griffith. But I think understanding that it is a shared load and reminding, I guess, coming back to the core principles of the code, which are really around just working towards creating safer spaces and safer experiences for our students and staff.
Excellent. Thank you.
And I think for me, just to remind everyone that trauma-informed starts with the first person someone shares their experience with, and that's where WIL coordinators in particular may have a really important role in just making someone feel heard and feel like there's support available and options available. And I guess the other thing is just around reiterating for people who do come forward that there's solutions available to work through in terms of making sure they still get placement recognition and can still progress with their coursework, even if it means a tweak to how that's done.
Well, thank you very much, Rhiannon. So one of the questions we've got from Pearl is a question just related to, often when an incident occurs, there's the university policies, and then often industry or community organizations will have their own policies, and just a question around how do you navigate the fact that you potentially have two different contexts. So just thoughts on that?
It is a curly one. I think this part of that pre-placement preparation should help address this, because we would have a policy and approach that would identify those key roles and responsibilities and a shared approach to resolving it. I do think it is can be challenging. And I also think that maybe it also comes back to the role of the student and how empowered they feel and their agency in working out who they want to support and help them through this.
Thank you very much. I might go to the next question, which is, should universities request declarations from providers before they host students to confirm that they have not been previously investigated for GBV?
I think there's an element where that would be really good if it were possible. At the same time, there's already been a lot of experiences of pushback around updates to agreements with placement providers. And so I think it is about trying to push for constant improvements, but it may be a big ask at this point in time to get that. There may be some who are willing to, though, and maybe that can be used for test cases and trying to improve that safety overall. Sorry, Megan, sort of jumped in at the same time.
I might just add to that, though, it's currently not legislated. So it is legislated that we do require those declarations for all new staff coming into universities, and we also require those declarations for all staff in student accommodation settings. So I guess the simple answer is no, but as Rhiannon just outlined, wouldn't that be a wonderful place to get to for our own assurance?
I think, and Megan, and I think that speaks to also the point around what data are you collecting, and also around student feedback and connecting the dots across data sets, because that's actually often a challenge, I think, with institutions. We've got another question, which is one that I think many of us are familiar with. Pre-placement can be a crowded space, having to convey lots of information to students. Do the panelists have any comments on success stories, how to best incorporate GBV prevention and response information across placement areas? So that's a little bit about the manageability piece of this.
It's
So
also
thoughts, folks?
It's kind of a nice little segue to promote the next webinar in the series as well, where we might be able to provide some cases for that. I think it's a lot of information. I know for us in my own program, we look at using case studies and scenarios to try and situate students, for example. I know our industry engagement team has quite strict processes around diversity, equity, and inclusion when onboarding industry and community hosts. So I think it's about trying to find ways in which to share and engage without being too overwhelming. And then you can always offer those additional resources and support.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Nicola. Rhiannon, do you want to add?
I was just going to say the other thing is around aligning different things that you're wanting students to know going in placement. So at Deakin, we've worked on a module that also includes elements around child safety and elements around, how to advocate for your rights as a disabled person within a placement setting and recognizing forms of discrimination that might exist beyond gender-based violence. And sometimes it can be around pulling all the things together and trying to weave them in so that you minimize the amount of information overload, but still get those key messages across.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I think that's really good. We actually also did a little peer-to-peer learning support group for each of our placement units. So students are connected to their peers throughout their placement, so they have another safe space to reflect and debrief. And I think that's been really, really useful around providing an additional safe space to share stories.
Fantastic. We've got another question, which is linking back to that due diligence. It's a question from Jessica. What are some suggestions or guidelines on how we might evaluate organizations for safety?
That's a big question too.
It is a big question.
And I think that's where, and in the accommodation space, those declarations are required. There's obviously an uplift in terms of blue card or working with children, and also a heightened level of training and development that is required across the staff and then residents in those spaces. I think it's about, I can only speak from a Griffith perspective, and certainly in everything we do at Griffith, we put the fact that we are values-based and we have a social justice background as a university at the forefront of everything that we do. So I'd like to think that the virtue of that is that we attract like-minded partners. I know the reality is that they're not all like that, and there are some certain areas that students will go to, or some certain providers that students will go to by virtue of limitation in discipline that might sit outside of that nice little rose-coloured glasses box that I'm living in. But I think it's really, the institution can really set the tone for what they expect. And I think it's about identifying where providers aren't reciprocating that, and maybe then having some conversations within your governance structures and your decision-making areas around what we do here. And do we pivot? What do we do?
And Megan, I think we're going to have to leave it at that with the last word. But can I just thank our three panelists today, Rhiannon, Megan, and Nicola. A really, really rich discussion. Just before everybody exits stage left, I'm delighted to say that this webinar is part of a two-part series, and the second webinar will occur on June the 10th. We're just finalizing the timing of that, and we will be promoting that. The second webinar will be very much focused on good practice examples and on case scenarios. So that's where we're going to get really into more of the weeds around this. So I warmly welcome you to join us for that second webinar. And just in closing, I want to very much thank, we had a fantastic partnership with our gender-based violence practitioners. And can I in particular just thank the planning team for the webinar, Megan, Nicola, Larissa Mendoza from ANU, Laura Birch from Monash, Rhiannon, thank you so much. And also Frederica Goodall from ANU. Again, this is when we talk partnership of WIL practitioners, these are the new terrains of partnership that we need to be thinking about. I also want to extend a warm thank you to WIL Australia for all of the support, the admin team. So Laura and Vanessa, thank you for always pulling everything together so beautifully and seamlessly. And also, I just want to acknowledge that this webinar has been brought to you by WIL Australia, but particularly from the Engagement and Advocacy Committee. And I just want to warmly thank all of the committee members. So I invite you to see this as the start of, I think, a really important national conversation. It's not a new conversation, but I think it's one that we're starting to think about in a very different way and in a much more connected way. And there's, I think, going to be a real richness of when we work in partnership across. And ultimately, that will benefit not just our students, but if we can tackle this well while students are at university, we are going to be sending into the workplace humans that also know how to engage as future work professionals, because this isn't going to change overnight. It's going to be a generational shift that's going to be needed. And what better ground to do this labor in such an intentional and partnership way than universities and tertiary institutions. So can I just again warmly thank all of the facilitators. Thank you, Faith, so much for being in the background and working with me on the Q&A and getting the slides seamless. And we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar. So have a lovely rest of your day and travel well. And we will see you in a few weeks, hopefully at the next webinar too. Thanks, everyone.
And thanks
Travel
for
well.
your work as well, Caroline. Bye,
Thank you.
everybody.